I'm Travis, and I'm 22 years old. I started working at Starbucks when I was still in high school, so 4 or 5 years now. Something happened about 6 months ago that was really scary. I would often work with a guy named Mark. We weren't really friends, but we got along all right. He actually went to the same school as me, and we were even in the same year. But we never really hung out. Mark started working there after we graduated, so I was more experienced than him. I was never promoted to manager or anything, but I was definitely in charge whenever we worked together. I could tell that it bothered him to be told what to do. I think he had a problem with authority. He would give off a bit of an attitude now and then, but it was nothing that serious. And I wasn't being a jerk or anything, just trying to do my job. One day, Mark and I were closing up. There were no customers in the place at this time. Our location was open till 10 p.m., which is late for a Starbucks, so the later hours are usually pretty quiet. Mark's girlfriend Sasha showed up at around 9:45. When we were just hanging out and getting ready to close. I was behind the counter and Mark was in the back doing something. Sasha went to our high school too, and I kind of knew her from then. She walked up to the counter and we started talking. There wasn't much for me to do, so I didn't mind the company. She came around the counter and we started chatting for maybe 5 minutes. At one point, she touched my arm in kind of a flirty way. I didn't think much of it at the time. In fact, I didn't think it was flirting at all. All of a sudden, Mark came out from the back. He was clearly angry. His face was red and his bottom lip was twitching. Right then, I realized that there was a camera pointed at us and there was a screen in the back where you could watch the security footage. Mark must have seen us and gotten the wrong idea. I figured he didn't say a word, just stared daggers at me. It was an awkward minute or so, and then I just walked away and finished up closing the place. Whatever issues those two had, it was none of my business. Once we finished closing the store, I went out the back exit with my bike, which I kept in the back room next to the rear exit. The back led to an alley where the garbage dumpsters were. I got on my bike and I rode home. I went into work. The next night, I was closing again, but Mark was not scheduled at all. A bit of a relief. I was glad to give him time to cool off from whatever happened the night before. The night dragged on, and when it was over, I was glad my other coworker, John, and I closed the place up. He went out the front entrance, and I locked it behind him. Then I went to the back exit and took my bike with me. I leaned my bike against the wall. Then I turned around to lock the back door. Once I did, I turned back around, and when I looked up, there was someone standing in front of me. He was wearing all black, a hoodie with his hood up, black pants, and over his face was a scary Halloween mask. I stood there like a deer in the headlights. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The alley was lit with only a single light attached to the building. It cast a dark shadow from my body onto the masked man. He took a step towards me, and at the same time he pulled out a knife. I started breathing heavily. I felt a few tears drip down my face. There was only one way out of the alley, and it was blocked by this crazed lunatic. The man kept inching closer, and before I knew it, we were fighting. We fell to the ground, and somehow I ended up on top. I managed to knock the knife out of his hand and landed a few good punches on him. One of those punches knocked the mask to the side. I saw his face, and it was Mark. He was beat. Red snot was dripping from his nose, and his eyes were bloodshot. I held him down for a minute until I realized that I couldn't call the police without letting him up. So I quickly jumped off and grabbed my bike and I rode away like the wind. I could hardly believe what happened. As I pedaled with all my might, I looked back every 10 or 15 seconds to make sure that he wasn't following me. Once I'd made it a safe distance, I called the police. They met me in the parking lot of a nearby store, and I told them what happened. Only then did I realize a stream of blood dripping down my left arm. At some point in our struggle, Mark managed to stab me with the knife, but I didn't even feel it at the time. The adrenaline must have masked the pain. The police noticed as well, and they called an ambulance. Just then I started to feel lightheaded, so I sat down on the ground. The next thing I remember was waking up in a hospital bed. My mom and dad were there waiting. I got 5 stitches in my arm, but luckily he didn't hit any tendons or large blood vessels. As for Mark, the police caught him that night, and he confessed to the attack. I believe his reasons had to do with what happened with Sasha that night, but maybe he just didn't like me. Mark did some time in jail for that, and he was fired. Of course, I never saw him again. My name is Julie and I am 21 years old, but this happened when I was 17. My first job was as a barista at Starbucks. The location where I worked was across town from where I lived. It was around a half-hour drive each way. That's long, but I couldn't find anything closer. It was a Thursday evening in September and my dad was driving me to work. My family only had a single car, so one of my parents would have to drive me every time. Since they couldn't be without the car for that long, it was a lot of trouble for them, but they were very supportive and they insisted on helping. The location where I worked was in a large plaza with many other stores. There was an Applebee's restaurant next door and there was a large parking lot in the middle with a bank and some other stores on the other side. We stopped the car in an empty spot near the front door. I got out and said goodbye to my dad. Then he drove away and I started my shift. Not much happened. For the first part of the evening, it was business as usual. There were only 5 or 6 customers in the place, all of whom were busy on their laptops. I was behind the counter trying to look busy in case my manager showed up. Suddenly the door opened and a man walked in. He was around 50. He wore a stretched out and faded black hoodie with blue jeans. As soon as he entered, the smell of cigarette smoke filled the room. The guy had the nerve to walk into a Starbucks smoking a cigarette. 1 or 2 of the customers looked at the guy, but none of them said anything. The guy stood there in the entrance and shot me a smile and he dropped his cigarette on the floor and stepped on it. My brow furrowed and the guy walked to the counter. I know I should have kicked him out for being so rude, but I didn't want to fight. I figured if I served him, he would leave. He approached the counter and said, "Vanilla Frappuccino with extra foam." "It's for my girlfriend." I entered it into the register and he paid with cash. I gave him his change and then I made his drink. When I gave it to him, he turned around and left the store. I was relieved that he was gone and nothing else happened. For the rest of my shift, this location closed at 08:00 p.m., but it would sometimes take longer to wrap everything up. I would always call my parents around 30 minutes before I was done. That way I could give them a chance to get here and they wouldn't have to wait in the car for too long. This time, however, I forgot. It was just before 8 when I realized that I didn't call for a ride. I pulled out my phone and called my dad. He said he would leave right away to pick me up. My coworker and I finished up and locked the doors. Then he took off. It was about 8:15 by then, and I figured I'd have to wait 10 or 15 minutes for my dad. There was a bench near the front door, so I took a seat and started scrolling through my phone. The sun was down, but the area was well lit by lamp posts. My head was down and I was focused on my phone. I was scrolling through Instagram or whatever else I was using to waste my time back then. After a few minutes, a shadow fell upon me. I looked up, and standing before me was that man from before. He wasn't alone, though. There were 2 other men with him. I dropped my phone on the ground from shock. The 3 of them were towering over me, and the one who I recognized from before was smiling. They were 2 or 3 feet away from me, so I stood up and tried to walk away, but they blocked me. Now I knew I was in trouble. I didn't say a word to them, but they were trying to talk to me. I can't remember exactly what they were saying, but it was something like, "Come on, we just want to talk." I was trying to get around one of them, but he continued to block me. I was about to burst out in tears when a strong pair of headlights blasted the 4 of us. With it came the frantic honking of a car's horn. It was my dad. He was just in time. As soon as that happened, the guys ran away. I jumped into the passenger seat of my dad's car. As soon as I looked at him, I realized that he was already on the phone with the police. He did his best to describe the men as he watched them run. We waited in the parking lot for the police, and they arrived within minutes. The officers were very kind and understanding while I told them my story. In my mind, nothing really happened. I mean, I was scared, but it was just a close call. My dad, however, took it much more seriously, and now I understand why. The men were eventually caught, and 2 out of 3 of them had pending charges for doing something similar to another girl. I never found out how those cases turned out, but I only hope that the victims were as lucky as me. This story is about a really scary thing that happened to me when I was working at Starbucks. I'm a 28-year-old woman, but I was 25 at the time. I was finishing up my master's degree and working around 25 hours a week at Starbucks. My school schedule was pretty flexible, and I worked the same shifts every week. Therefore, I got to know many of the regular customers at that location. I was friends with 2 of the other girls who worked there. Macy was an assistant manager, and she was a few years older, maybe in her mid-30s. Angie was around my age, and she was also a student, but in a different program. My job was pretty easy, but it was really boring and repetitive. Each day seemed the same, and I often had trouble remembering. Yesterday from a week ago. There was one regular customer named Daryl, and he came in almost every single day when I was there. Daryl was probably around 40 years old. He was average height and wore a plaid collared shirt most days. He was slim with thinning, short black hair, a pretty generic-looking guy, nothing out of the ordinary. The only thing that really made him stand out was that he was awkward. This guy had the personality of a mouse. He always had a timid look on his face. I was often surprised that he even managed to squeeze out his order. When he came to the counter, he ordered a coffee and then looked down. He never made eye contact. I was polite to him, as I always am, and then I took his order. I handed him his coffee and he took it. Then he turned around without saying a word. It was around 2 in the afternoon, and my shift went until 6 p.m. I didn't see Daryl again for the next 4 hours. When I got off, it was already dark. It was January, so the sun went down at around 5 p.m. I said goodbye to my coworkers, and then I headed out the front door. I stepped out onto the sidewalk in front of the store and put on my hat. It was cold out, but not snowing. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see someone standing on the corner of the building to my right. He was dark, but when I looked, I could tell that it was Daryl. When he noticed that I'd seen him, his eyes pointed down to the ground, and he walked around the corner. I was a little creeped out because I didn't understand why he would still be there, but there could be a reasonable explanation for it. So I turned the other way and walked to the bus stop. I looked over my shoulder subtly while I was walking, but I didn't see him again. The next time I went in for work, I didn't see Daryl, which was unusual. In fact, the entire week went by and I didn't see him a single time. I was honestly a little relieved because he was really starting to scare me. Eventually, I asked one of my co-workers, Macy, if she knew anything about it. Macy pulled me into the supply closet and shut the door. "You didn't hear?" she said. "No." "Hear what?" I asked. Macy leaned over and whispered into my ear. "He followed Angie home from work last week. He tried to force his way into her apartment. She managed to fight him off and called the police. Daryl's in jail. We won't be seeing him anymore." I gasped in shock. I didn't know what to say. Macy never told me which day it happened, but I'm pretty sure it was the day when I saw him standing there outside the store. It's really scary to think of what he might have done if he'd gotten into her apartment. Angie eventually returned to work after several weeks off as a mental health leave. We never saw Daryl again. And if I ever do see him again, it will be too soon.